So we'll start with setting the motivation. And so just take a minute and reconnect with your current impression of your Buddha nature, your Buddha potential. And imagine that with the mantra, it is stimulated and awakened, brought to the surface. Tayai tai om mune mune maha mune soha. Tayai tai om mune mune maha mune soha. Taya ta om mune mune maha mune soha. And in particular, engaging with altruism. So last week we were having some good question and answer and some good discussion, and I really appreciate it so much that you guys were feeling brave to ask things and discuss things. Thank you so much. And from that, I thought maybe it's a good idea for us to do the course overview again. We did the course overview, in the first couple of days of the semester before we all went online. And, it was still, new coming back together, getting used to the semester. And then we had all of this craziness with the virus. And it's quite normal and natural for us to a little bit lose the thread of what exactly is happening here and what are we doing and why are we doing it. So I thought to just kind of really ground us today. And once we're kind of grounded in the context once again, then we can either move forward or we can have some more question and answer. So today, let's just take a minute and think about your semesters so far. Okay, so in the beginning, you were looking at the overview of the Buddhist path, right? Just the general ideas about where suffering comes from and where happiness comes from, and generally how the mind works and the main topics, right? It was just kind of an overview of the whole Buddhist path, a little bit about the history of Buddhism and the different types, and it was just kind of getting a sense of it, right? And then Venerable Children came and she was introducing you to the mind. So that's where we had the mind part 1. So in the mind part 1, the main point was to understand that the mind goes through an evolution, and it also goes from coarse to subtle. So it goes from an evolution from afflicted and ignorant to awakened and wise and compassionate. That's the evolution that the mind can go through with training. And together with that is a sense of also understanding that there are coarser minds that are more sensorial, and there are subtler minds that are more mental. There's also coarser minds that are more conceptual, and subtler minds that are more perceptual and direct. So that was kind of the general idea of the mind part 1, was just kind of to understand that the mind's development is something that you can orchestrate. Right? The mind's development isn't something that just happens by chance. It's something that you can take the reins of and make happen. And in order to do that, it really helps to understand the mechanisms of the mind. So that was the mind part 1. And one of the more advanced topics within that, which you probably only spent a couple days on, were the 7 types of awareness. And the 7 types of awareness was the main discussion on minds going from coarse to subtle, from inaccurate to accurate, from conceptual to perceptual, that kind of sequence. So the 7 types of awareness, or low-rig minds and awareness, that's the stuff that was more complicated. What was more directly accessible is that the mind is clear and knowing, that the stains are adventitious, right? The mind is by nature clear and knowing. All of the mistakes, all of the bad habits, all of the suffering are additional. They're not intrinsically one with the mind. They're just with it right now, the way mud and water would mix, but they can be separated. Right? Does that sort of ring some bells? The mind part 1 was generally those things, yeah. Then the mind part 2, with Venerable Sangye Kadro, you were looking at minds and mental factors. And the idea there was to understand very specifically the difference between positive states of mind and negative states of mind, to understand the difference between main minds and mental factors, and to understand which mental factors are always there as opposed to the ones that are more occasional. And in knowing that, then whatever topic you plug into the mind, it helps you understand kind of what are the mechanisms to make it integrate. You know, what's the thing that creates what maybe in psychology you would call a cognitive shift? What makes a realization happen? And the main point is usually repetition, yeah? An accurate understanding and repetition. How that repetition happens, it needs to be something that has types of focus. It's something that needs to have an accurate motivation. And basically, main minds and mental factors, there are so many divisions, aren't there? Of minds, there was 6 divisions of main minds. Of mental factors, there were 6 categories, but 51 that were discussed. You know, it's a big list. But the main idea is basically the mind has got 2 aspects all the time. The aspect that is kind of clarity, awareness, reflective, spacious, the aspect that is moving, the aspect that is judging and deciding, the aspect that is feeling, right? So sky, clouds, yeah, minds, mental factors. So to say that something is a mental factor doesn't mean that it's necessarily negative, but for us, all of our even positive states of mind are colored by ignorance. Yeah. So the mind part 2 was minds and mental factors in a nutshell, and looking at the difference between main minds and mental factors, the difference between positive states of mind and negative states of mind, how to increase one and diminish the other. Is that ringing bells? It's the main point, yeah. Okay. And so then we move now to the mind part 3, and the mind part 3 is about Buddha nature, which is the mind's potential for transformation from another perspective. So before it was like the mind's transformation, how and why. Now it's like the mind's transformation, what is reality anyway? What are the levels of truth? What is the meaning and purpose of life? And what is my role within engaging with that? You know, it becomes a bit more spacious, it becomes a bit more abstract, but the main framework is very simple. The main framework is understanding basis, path, and result. Yeah, the main framework is understanding basis, path, and result. The basis being the two truths: relative truth or conventional truth, ultimate truth or absolute truth, right? And that basis category is what we call mind science, which doesn't rely on faith. These are all things that can be tested with experience and logic. So what you do with the two truths is up to you. But the fact of the true truths isn't something that we question with the idea that it's wrong. We question it with the idea of how do we access it and penetrate it. Does that make sense? So the fact that there is a relative reality that is conventional and worldly, and the fact that all things have an ultimate reality, is something that is an invitation to explore, less an invitation to say, is that even true or not? Although, of course, we need to do that for a while. But it's the more scientific approach, and it's the area where scientists and psychotherapists and quantum physicists like to engage with Buddhist thought about, because there's a lot of harmony and synchronization with that level. Yeah, so the basis is the basis. Two truths. Now, what you do with it is the path. Yeah, so because of the two truths, what do you do with the fact of the ultimate and the fact of the relative? And from a Buddhist perspective, you practice method and wisdom, right? You practice method in response to relative truth. You practice wisdom in response to ultimate truth. So what that means is that in the method side, you will realize that this life has an illusory nature, and yet that's how we live, that's what we know. What are skillful ways to respond within that to make our relative a more accurate relative and less, kind of contaminated by our own projections? So our response to the relative is compassion. Our response to the relative is loving kindness, is patience, all of these really beautiful qualities that everyone agrees on. That's our response to seeing the relative world. That's our path. And in response to our knowledge or our understanding or our belief in the ultimate, then we have to practice the wisdom that realizes that. So there's the fact of it, but then there's the realization of it. And there are two separate things. Yeah, so there's the fact that things are empty of inherent existence, and then there's the mind that needs to practice knowing that and remembering it. You with me? So it's, so don't mix it all together, right? The fact of the ultimate is a fact, whether you know it or not, whether you do anything with it or not. Things are empty of inherent existence because they dependently arise, right? But then the mind that understands that is the mind that will eventually cut the root of samsara. Yeah, knowing the way that there is a dysfunctional way of responding to life, and knowing that the root of that is innate ignorance, that's what's going to cut the negative patterns that lead to suffering and lead to negative behavior. Does that make sense? So on one level, the method, we're sort of preventing negative states of mind and antidoting negative states of mind. That's what we're doing on the method side, preventing and antidoting. On the other hand, we're also developing positive states of mind and accessing more and more happiness in our daily life. But we're not fundamentally uprooting the problem. It's like we've gotten a really good system for managing our diabetes, but we haven't gotten rid of our diabetes. So say you were diagnosed with diabetes, right? Sugar sickness. The doctor tells you have diabetes, you change your diet, right? You try to exercise differently, you do different things, and then you live as if you don't have it in a way, because sometimes your symptoms can be so settled, it's as if you no longer have the disease. But if for one day you forgot that you had diabetes and ate the wrong things and did the wrong things, you would immediately have a diabetic response, right? And you would crash. So this is how we are, yeah? We have diabetes, or we have innate grasping itself, and we can get on top of it and manage the symptoms of it just fine using methods in the relative level. Absolutely. But if we forget, immediately suffering, immediately negative states of mind, they just pop right up because we haven't actually cured ourselves. So the ultimate, and then the wisdom recognizing the ultimate, this is how we get to the cure so that we're not sick anymore. Okay, so you have the path, method, and wisdom, which leads to the result, right? What is the result? The result is Buddhahood. What is Buddhahood? Buddhahood, enlightenment, is the result of the path. Yeah, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's the process your mind has undergone. So the two results are the two Buddha bodies. The method body, right? The body that came from method, those are your form bodies. Yeah? The result of having known about ultimate truth and practiced that knowledge are your truth bodies or your dharmakayas. Yeah? So when we say the results are the two Buddha bodies, we're just using the simple division of form bodies and truth bodies. But we can subdivide those each. Yeah, and that's where I think a lot of folks were getting lost and confused, was the subdividing of the subdividing of the subdividing of the Buddha bodies. All of it is Buddhahood, enlightenment, the result of having practiced. What we're talking about is, once you've practiced, what are you like? What can you do? How are you? How are you internally? How are you externally? Is there even such a thing as internal and external anymore? What is a Buddha like? Yeah. And so instead of just saying, isn't it wonderful to think of enlightenment in a Buddha who is omniscient and compassionate and has all these abilities, isn't that lovely? We frame it in terms of, it is lovely, but it's a direct result of something. It's a direct result of a mind that practices. That's what a mind that practices turns into. Does it make sense? So a mind that practices method turns into form bodies for advanced practitioners and for ordinary practitioners, right? It turns into form bodies that are able to reach those who already have some realizations. That's the Sambhogakaya. Then it's also able to manifest as anything for the sake of us ordinary people. And our ordinary level of realization is so small that the Buddha has to work with our karma and manifest in ways that might seem imperfect or ordinary or not even a human. It might have to manifest as a book or a bridge or a gust of wind or a piece of poetry, but something that stimulates the mind into evolution. So these two form bodies are what we need to benefit others. And you can't have form bodies without having truth bodies. And that those two dharmakayas are for the release of your own suffering, the release of your own negative states of mind, the release out of your own contaminated thoughts. Yeah. So the two dharmakayas, one is the result of the naturally present Buddha nature, the swabhavikakaya, the nature truth body. That just arrives as the result of the fact that your mind has always been empty of inherent existence, and that's been naturally present, but it hasn't functioned as a fully formed Buddha body until the other three are complete. The other piece of the Dharma body is the Jhana Dharmakaya, the wisdom truth body, and that's the result of having realized emptiness. So there's the fact of the mind's emptiness, and then there's the realization of the mind's emptiness, and those result in the two Buddha bodies, which are for your own sake and for your own welfare, the release of your own suffering. Are you with me so far? Is anybody lost? Yeah, speak up if you've got a point to clarify, please.
I don't know if it's makes sense, but why is the wisdom in the ultimate and the compassion and love and kindness and the relative? It's as if when you reach the ultimate and you realize emptiness, you don't need any more compassion and love and kindness because everybody's...
It's like, we have to always remember that conventional truth, relative truth, is by nature deceptive. And the biggest deception is the illusion of our own separateness. So it's not that we're one, but we are completely connected. Yeah, we're completely connected. So the illusion in the relative is that we're these separate, unrelated beings. So to combat that illusion of separateness, we need to actively open the heart to connect to others. You know, we need empathy and sympathy and then compassion and loving kindness and bodhicitta in order to kind of free up or reveal the pathways between us so that we respond in a way that is healthy for the whole system, rather than what seems to be necessary from the perspective of the relative, which is to just work on the health of this one area here. Yeah, because there's an illusion that this is the only area that's affecting me, and affecting others is their business, and everyone is little independent islands with no bridges connecting them. So if you realize the ultimate, you would still practice in the relative, but it would be with a completely different understanding, completely piercing the veil of the illusion of separateness. So you wouldn't need to overcome your anger in order to be patient and loving. You would just be patient and loving because anger no longer makes sense. You know, so your behaviors would still be loving, compassionate behaviors, but they wouldn't be responses or antidotes to the mistake because you don't have the mistake anymore. I don't know if that helps. Yeah, so our work in the relative, we have to remember, is always has a deceptive quality to it, and we're trying to manage and navigate around the deceptive appearance of our life. The deception being that things appear inherently existent when the opposite is true. And right now we just need to navigate around that the best we can, whether it's dispelling our afflictions, or it's going around our afflictions, or it's preventing our afflictions, or it's transforming our afflictions. We have to kind of respond to the fact that we're operating from ignorance. When that ignorance is dispelled, then the heart is just open and you don't have to make positive states of mind. Positive states of mind are the only rational choice. Does that make sense? Okay, so we were talking about the basis, the path, and the result in general, and then we shifted to thinking about the dispositions, right? Remember, we were looking at dispositions and how, all right, everyone has Buddha nature, everyone has Buddha potential. The fact of life is relative truth and ultimate truth. How do people practice the path? And how different people practice the path is very much dictated by their relative reality and the habits they've accumulated from beginningless time in response to the illusion. So for some people, going full speed ahead along the path, you know, jumping right in, makes perfect sense. For some people, that doesn't make perfect sense, and they need just very gentle, very gradual approaches. And so we looked at the sutra perspective of the 5 families and the tantra perspective of the 5 families. And they were 2 very different presentations, but it was about being able to recognize who you are, who they are, with the background idea of how do I transform? How can I help them transform? because all of our potential is for release into complete peace, release into complete happiness, and perfect ability to be of benefit. We all have the identical potentiality, but our roads to get there are going to be incredibly varied and diverse. Yeah, so we need to recognize that. And just in the most basic of examples, you know that what works for you doesn't necessarily work for everyone else. We know this, you know. Some people, when they're grieving and they're feeling disconnected and anxious, need physical contact. Some people need space. Some people need a dialogue. Some people need silence. And, you know, if you go in assuming that everyone has the same disposition as you, then you become frustrated at them or frustrated at yourself of why doesn't this work? If you go in it with an understanding of dispositions, then you're able to navigate the kind of infinite variations of people and not take any of it personally. But it also means that you know yourself. So you're not beating your head against the wall trying to do techniques that you're not ready for, or hitting your head against the wall doing techniques you learned long ago but feeling like you need to be there just because that's what people say. Do you understand? So we have this whole discussion of dispositions. So this, despite the fact of people's equality in terms of their Buddha potential, there's infinite variation in people's responses to the illusion of inherent existence. How people have responded to that is really very varied. Yeah. So we looked at dispositions, and then we shifted to looking at what awakens a disposition and helps evolve a disposition. And we moved into the conversation of what is a teacher and what is a student. How are we as a teacher? How are we as a student? Even if we don't frame our life in that way, even if we're not a Buddhist teacher or a Buddhist student per se, what does it mean to be in the mentor role? What does it mean to be in the mentee role? What are the criterias for each? What makes those functional or dysfunctional? Because the main idea is that we need interaction in order to develop. And is that something that we believe, that interaction is something that facilitates progress? And then the question becomes interaction with what? You know, interaction with who? And is what we're interacting with as external as it started in the beginning? What we were interacting with for our own development was maybe ideas and a person who represented those ideas. And then as we become more developed and integrated, it becomes more an inner conversation between our afflictions and our wisdom. Hopefully the wisdom is having more and more power over time. But it started as a relationship. Yeah. So these are the processes that we were going through. And now recently we've been talking about then the meditations that help bring forward our potential, access it, touch it, and then how do we develop it having touched it? Yeah, so that's where we are now, is the meditations that help bring that to light, help us connect with it, and then go on to develop it. Do you feel oriented? Yeah. Are there any of the connections that you're lost about the relationship between one topic and another, or what some of the bits were?
Actually, last week was clear, and it was an organizing lesson for me.
Good, good. Yeah. Look, I know it's been hard for all of us. It's hard for you to understand me and hard for me to understand you in this whole other format that we're in. You know, I only see your little faces, and they might be 2 or 3 seconds delayed, and you know, you might be responding to something in the background of your house and it looks like you're responding to something I said. Who knows what's really happening? And you know, if I don't know what I'm responding to, then I'm just full speed ahead, and that might be too fast sometimes, and I don't know if I've lost you or not because I can't really read the room. And I know it's been hard, and I really appreciate you guys being patient with the process and not just kind of throwing your hands up and saying, too much, you know. So I really appreciate your patience with all of this, and slowly, as they say. Okay. So continuing on, we'll look at page 66 in your main text. So on page 66, we're continuing this discussion of meditating on the clarity of the mind, and then moving from just becoming aware of the clarity of the mind to then going to see the emptiness of the clarity of the mind in order to cut the root of samsara and to go on to development. And so the technique here is the Dzogchen or Mahamudra technique, which in some forms of Buddhism, they are synonymous terms, and in other forms of Buddhism, they're slightly different. For our purposes right now, let's just leave it as a synonym, while in the back of your mind knowing if you go to the Kagyu tradition or the Sakyu tradition, there's some slight variation in the way these things are described. If the idea of Mahamudra meditation is really intriguing to you and something that you really like, I think the best book is the Geluk Kagyu tradition of Mahamudra by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's an amazing book, and it goes into a lot of detail. There's also a very simple book on Mahamudra by Lama Yeshe that was recently published. So more on that as it develops. And your book, Ego, Attachment, and Liberation, is giving you introductory ways to meditate in this way, even though he's not giving it a big title or a big heading saying, now we are doing Mahamudra. That's actually what he's leading us to in his very gentle, sort of skillful, westernized way. Yeah. So at the top of the page, they then make statements such as, if you unravel this secret, you will be liberated. Dundrup Jigme Tempe Nyingma and his disciple, Sultram Zangpo, who are great Dzogchen scholars and practitioners, said that the mere presence of this primordial wisdom within us alone cannot liberate us. Why not? At the time of death, all other minds have dissolved, and only the primordial mind remains, or the fundamental consciousness. Even though it is manifested and all the infinite numbers of deaths we have experienced in samsara, that has not helped us to attain Buddhahood, right? Just the fact that the primordial mind arises isn't enough. It happens every time we die. We just haven't recognized it or done anything with it, right? So it arises, but we haven't used it. These two sages say that in order to attain Buddhahood, it is necessary to utilize the primordial wisdom to realize emptiness. Only that will liberate us. This is consistent with Tsongkhapa's view, Tsongkhapa being Lama Tsongkhapa, the main figure in our tradition. Some commentaries on Dzogchen and Mahamudra say, this wisdom that abides in the afflictions is the true wisdom. And on this basis, every sentient being is already a Buddha. Okay, so some commentaries on Dzogchen and Mahamudra say this. Some forms of psychology say this, right? That there is wisdom within the affliction, right? So this is a point of kind of examination and discussion, because it's not completely true and it's not completely untrue either. I think the danger is if we oversimplify or make things always or never, then we run into some danger here. So if you say, you know, to someone who is, I don't know, angry about the political situation, whatever political situation you'd like, there's plenty of options right now, right? You could say that anger is a natural response to the political situation. To say natural means habitual. To say natural does not mean necessary or accurate or useful, right? Or needed. And yet, the fact of the anger can show us something about our own mind if we allow it, if we choose to, right? So, you know, you get angry, whether it's a good idea or not, who knows, but you're angry. Okay, you're angry. What do you do with the fact that you're angry? Well, you can ask yourself, what is the wisdom within the response, while acknowledging there is a great deal of affliction within the response. It's not saying the affliction is wisdom. That's the mistake, and that's the oversimplification that people do. The affliction is wisdom. No, it's not. But there is a part of your mind that is recognizing a dissonance, or is recognizing a relative harm that needs to, you know, take a step back from and examine, to look at our own role in, to look at what solutions we can offer, etc., etc. But if you believe that anger is wisdom, then you start to need anger in order to access a sense of what is just or unjust, or you start to need anger in order to bring a strong or passionate response, or you rely on anger to show you if things are wrong or not, and you become more and more like an animal and more likely to perpetuate the cycle of violence, which is completely natural, but not necessary or needed. Do you know what I mean? So we don't want to oversimplify and say, oh, you know, afflictions are wisdom. No, there is wisdom and there is afflictions, and they alternate very quickly. Catch the wisdom, hang on to it, examine it, and let the affliction around it dissolve. And don't take vividness as a criteria for truth. Don't take passion as a criteria for truth. The fact that you're having a strong reaction doesn't make something more significant, right? We've attributed the significance of things. And yet, there are things in the relative world that are harmful that we could address. So it's remembering this fundamental premise that an affliction is that which makes the mind unpeaceful. Do you remember this definition of an affliction? That which makes the mind unpeaceful. That is an affliction. So if the mind is unpeaceful, there is an affliction present and driving. You might not even know which one it is. It might just be amorphous anxiety. It might just be a kind of scatteredness, but there is an affliction there, which means you're not operating from wisdom, even if the words in your mind have wisdom to them or accurate observation in them. Yeah? And all of this just means allow the affliction to settle enough that the mind's clarity reasserts itself, or you reveal it back to yourself, and then examine the same observation with a wisdom mind, then make your choices, then do your actions. So the natural response for human beings is to only act when things are uncomfortable, when we're outraged, when we're disappointed, when we're sad, when we're grief-stricken, and we need some sort of, I don't know, explosive inner response or reaction in order to act. And it's understandable, but it's not necessary. And in fact, it does perpetuate more of the same, even if in the immediate there are good changes that get made, even if in the immediate it seems like we won, the energy of it just comes back around eventually, and the cycle of violence never ends. You know, see history for details, right? So that's, it's a fundamental premise within the Dzogchen and Mahamudra teachings that there is this debate that happens about what does it actually mean to say that there is wisdom within the afflictions, because there's a lot of layers to it. But it's a little bit similar to saying there is Buddha nature, but that doesn't mean you're a Buddha. But by identifying with your Buddha nature, you come closer to being a Buddha. Yeah. So it's a similar kind of idea, and it's easy to oversimplify. So, continuing on, although we have been Buddhas for beginningless time, we have to be awakened again. This is their view, right? We have to be awakened again, which doesn't make sense, right? If you're awake, how can you fall asleep? But anyway, some people think this. The wisdom that we have now is the omniscient mind of a Buddha, and the three bodies of a Buddha exist innately in each sentient being. Sentient beings have a basis of essential purity, that is not merely emptiness, but is endowed with three aspects. Its entity is the Dharmakaya, the mode of abiding of pristine wisdom. Its nature is the enjoyment body, the appearance aspect of that mind. And compassion is the emanation bodies, its radiance or expression. In short, they say that all three Buddha bodies are present, fully formed in our ordinary state, but since they are obscured, we are not aware of their presence. Some such statements, taken literally, are fraught with problems. Yeah, so, just highlight, star. You will come across, especially Western authors or non-Tibetan, non-Himalayan scholars who are, well-educated, but not necessarily practitioners, espousing this view with great authority as if they have figured it out, and their students really miss out as a result of it. So be a little bit cautious. I don't want to say be cautious of Western teachers by virtue of their Westernness, but I think there is something to be said for the Geshe system that, takes 20 years of study, the last 5 years of which are public debates and examinations. People that have a Geshe degree are very, very clear about content and practice and much more reliable. So if you have a teacher that's more accessible because they're more like you, that's excellent, but it sometimes can be the watered down version. So it's good to always link back to the source to make sure that we haven't oversimplified things, because that means we won't have the complete effect that we want. It means that we won't have the fully fledged result that we need to be of benefit to others. Okay, so while some people are partial and unfair in their criticism and refute misconceptions in only some traditions, Chankya Rilpe Dorje was unbiased and pointed out incorrect interpretations in all 4 Tibetan traditions, including his own Gaelic tradition, or tradition. In his Song of the Experience of the View, he says, "I say this not out of disrespect to these masters, but perhaps they only had less exposure to rigorous philosophical investigation of the great treatises and were unable to use certain terminology appropriately." Right? That is, the difficulty in their assertions lies in the broad use of terminology that is not grounded in the authority of the great treatises. Of course, Chankya's comments do not apply to Dzogchen and Mahamudra masters such as Dundrup Jigme Tempe Nyingma and his teacher Awa Pachu, who have done serious philosophical study and examination of the great treatises, and who ground their understanding of Dzogchen in them. Their interpretations and writings are excellent. So all 4 Tibetan traditions teach practices that search for the mind. Yeah, all 4 Buddhist traditions and all traditions of Buddhism in general. And each of them have their strength and each of them have their weakness. Just because the time since the Buddha was living in front of us has been a long time. It's been, 2,600 years since we had the Buddha in front of us to give us the whole story in its complete form. So time goes by and the teachings spread all over the world, and some oral traditions have stayed very pure and some of them have gotten more mistakes and other influences in them, and it's only natural. So there are kind of many renaissances throughout Buddhism where things will have gotten a little bit untidy and a little incomplete, and then another practitioner who becomes a Buddha will gather everything back together and say, okay, I've tidied it up again, everyone. Here you go. Here's the complete story. Yeah, and it'll stay tidy and complete for a few hundred years, and then it'll get all tangled and messy again, and another teacher will come and tidy it up. And I'm guessing that 200, 300 years from now, we will look back and see the 14th Dalai Lama as one of these great masters pulling everything back together and tidying everything up. I think hindsight will tell us that. But there's been many, and there will continue to be many, who, as just the natural human nature, things get messy. There will be Buddhas who come and tidy it up again so that we have the complete picture. Okay. So all 4 Tibetan traditions teach practices that search for the mind, where it came from, where it goes, what its shape and color are, and so forth. Speaking of this shared practice, Chankya said that after searching in this manner, we find that the mind is not tangible, lacks color and shape, does not come from one place or go to another. Discovering this, meditators experience a sensation of voidness. However, this voidness is not the emptiness of inherent existence, that is the ultimate reality of the mind. It is the mere absence of the mind being a tangible object. So this is an experience that a lot of people have in meditation in the beginning, where they finally are getting good at this clarity of mind meditation. You know, they're moving away from the clouds, getting into the sky, seeing the vast vacuity, spaciousness, reflectiveness. It's very blissful. And then they think they've realized emptiness when they've realized the lack of tangibility. Yeah, so it's still going in the right direction. It's still excellent, but it's not a realization of emptiness. And I think what's interesting is to see even that, even just realizing that the mind is not the brain, is really powerful. It's incredible. So it's not to say it's not a worthwhile thing to have happened, just don't mislabel it and think that you've finished and that you've got it. You know, there's more to be done. Okay. So although someone may think this voidness is ultimate reality and meditate in that state for a long time, this is not meditation on the ultimate nature of the mind. There are two ways to meditate on the mind. The first is as above, examining whether the mind has color, shape, location, tangibility, and so forth. This leads to the sense that the conventional nature of mind lacks these qualities. One, right? Then over the page. The second is meditation on the ultimate nature of the mind, in which we examine the mind's ultimate mode of existence and discover its emptiness of inherent existence. People who confuse these two ways of meditating on the mind and think that the mind's absence of tangibility, color, and so forth is the mind's ultimate nature may criticize masters such as Dignata and Dharmakirti for their precise expositions of debate, logic, and reasoning, saying these only increase preconceptions. Okay, so this is a very common argument that you hear nowadays of all of this logic, all of these lists, all of this reasoning. This is just unnecessary wordiness. Let's just touch the experience of it. Let's just get through the words and touch the real heart essence. A lot of people want to do this. A lot of people have this reactivity. I completely relate. I've had it myself. And yet that very logic, those very lists, those very definitions keep you from misidentifying your own experience. Yeah, they keep you from misidentifying your own experience. And if you accurately identify your own experience, then you know what needs to come next. You know what to do. You can be your own teacher, be your own therapist. You know what needs to happen next. Or you know what questions to ask or where to seek clarification. Because even if you don't remember all the 7 types of awareness, you remember that that topic exists. So you can come back and examine that topic when it seems relevant to your practice. The door is open to you. Does it make sense? So it's normal to have resistance and reactivity to all the lists and the logic and the definitions. Completely normal, because of course that side of things has a dryness until you are bringing experience to it, or until you're meeting someone who very obviously has it and is communicating that through their teaching style. It's totally normal. And, you know, just notice that reaction, be kind to yourself, take it easy, but remember that without it, we become a bit spacey and unfinished, and then our power is less, and our ability to benefit others is less, because we don't have a framework to hold us and move us forward, and we start reinventing the wheel. Yeah. Okay, so Guntung Konchok Tempe Drogme, and I know these names are not familiar to you, but just planting seeds. Another master who was impartial in his critical analysis of Tibetan Buddhist traditions said he found this amazing. Some people believe there is no need for reasoning or investigations on the path, that simply by having faith and receiving the blessings of a guru, primordial wisdom will arise. In this light, I've been very happy to see the establishment of more shedras, academic institutions, that teach the classical philosophical texts from India and Tibet. Some Westerners similarly do not value Dharma study and investigation, perhaps because Buddha Dharma is relatively new in the West. Without a comprehensive understanding of the Buddha Dharma, people tend to seek the easiest and shortest path to awakening, a path that does not require giving up their attachments. Such an attitude exists amongst Tibetans as well. Tsongkhapa said that many people think that the Buddha's qualities are wonderful, but when a spiritual mentor explains through reasoning and scriptural citations how to attain them, they become discouraged and say, who can actually achieve such realizations? So see yourself within those words, have a sense of humor and friendliness. Okay. And I think, you know, who's saying this? His Holiness is saying this. Remember, this teaching is coming from His Holiness. And I remember once I was at a teaching with His Holiness in Utah in the United States. And in Utah, there's a huge Tibetan community. There's a bunch of Tibetan refugees there. And in Salt Lake City, which if you know Salt Lake City, it's kind of bizarre to think that there's a ton of Tibetan Buddhists there together with the Mormons, and it's all very confusing. But anyway, there's a lot of Buddhists and a lot of Tibetans in Salt Lake City. Who knew? So he was giving a public talk, you know, just a nice public talk about universal responsibility, about loving kindness and compassion. It was just a classic public talk. And it was beautiful and lovely. And then he stopped and he switched to Tibetan. And he stopped teaching in English. He started teaching in Tibetan fiercely. Yeah, he was fierce, and he was not smiley and cuddly and cute anymore. He was being fierce. He was being Manjushri with his sword cutting through ignorance. And my Tibetan is good enough to pick up the highlights. And he was basically saying, there is nothing special about Tibetans except the Dharma. There's nothing special about being a Tibetan except for the Dharma. And so if you're not holding the Dharma, you're like every other person. And what is the point in your like national pride and your Tibetan identification and you're this and you're that? Because before the teachings, there had been all of these cute like folk dancing and Tibetan music and Tibetan crafts. And it was all like a Tibetan celebration of, you know, culture. All of which is lovely, but normally the best offering for His Holiness is if people debate in front of him. He doesn't care about dancing and singing and flowers, like he'll enjoy it like everyone else, but the best offering to His Holiness is to show your knowledge, because what He wants us to do is practice, because He doesn't want us to suffer. All right. And so when you go to Dharamsala, the offerings will be, you know, music and dancing and whatever. But then the senior students will come and debate in front of him, and then the less senior students, and then eventually even the little kids. And that makes him happy. He's like, that is a good present. Yeah. And the most delighted I ever saw him with a gift was the kids at the TCV, the Tibetan Children's Village, lay children, not monks and nuns, boys and girls together, maybe 8 or 9 years old, debating Buddhist philosophy in front of him. And he was so delighted. He was just so delighted, like, okay, yeah, this is worthwhile. So, so it's not to say that the cultural aspects of everybody's religion isn't significant or isn't good for bonding. Of course it is. And what is the main point of identification if not to share the wisdom of that? You know? And if you're divorced from the wisdom of that, it's just another set of clothes to wear, right? Or it's just another set of over-identifications that can leave room for divisiveness, conflict, othering, etc. So it was sweet that he scolded them, I thought. He was saying, if you want to be special, learn the Dharma, right? That's the unique feature. Yeah. Your folk dances are cute, preserve them if you want to, but the point is the Dharma. Yeah. Thoughts? Reactions? Is it okay? Is it too strong? Are you offended? What's going on? Yeah, look, I know as much as anyone about feeling like I've had enough words and I just want to be a kind person. I just want to be an effective person. I just want to be a happy person, and enough with the lists already, and enough with the definitions already. I know that feeling, and it's totally fine. Be a good person. And then when you're finding it not easy to be as good, kind, or happy as you thought, then you go, yeah, right, I need some more lists. I need some more logic. I need to really get to the root of why do I not live up to my core values? Why do I not embody my core values? Why don't I communicate them? What's the block? What do I need to do to remove those things? You know, how do I become, you know, the change I want to see in the world? How do I do that? And in the moments of spiritual crisis or dark nights of the soul, the thing that will save you is logic. Because if you've only been relying on your emotional response to content, when something confronts that, you're really, really in danger. But if you have some solid logic, especially together with some experience of resonance with that logic, that will carry you through the darkest times.
I was thinking about how the experience of logic is so different than logic. What do you say about that?
True. I mean, when is it logic that is medicine and when is it just information? I think, you can know that there is a law of gravity, but if you've fallen down the stairs, you really remember there's a law of gravity. Similarly, if you remember that karma, cause and effect, positive actions lead to happiness, negative actions lead to suffering. That's interesting, it makes sense on one level, but then when you're experiencing the bad behavior of others and you think, what is my role in this? Then you really start to ask deeper questions about what exactly is cause and effect. What are the factors in place and which of those factors do I have any influence over? Or do I, And so I think that the logic that kind of becomes your medicine or becomes your protection during the dark times, you're right, it's not just logic, it's your relationship to logic, it's your experience of the logic. But it helps for you to have, a structure or a sequence to lead your mind down when your mind is kind of lost in ambiguity and anxiety and confusion, to kind of land it to, okay, the purpose of my life is because leading to, and you've worked yourself through those processes in quiet moments where there was no chaos. And so they're like, for lack of a better word, neuropathways, but really there are pathways within the mind that you can then kind of go back into. They're roads that have already been traveled. You don't have to break new ground. You've already traveled those roads. Now you just have to bring yourself back to them and the flow arises. It's like maybe in therapy you come to some breakthrough about why you are the way you are in a certain context. And that initial breakthrough is really important and useful. But unless you repeat it and kind of go back through it, it doesn't become as strong a pathway. So you might fall into the same traps, you might do the same behaviors despite knowing better. But once it's a pathway, then if you make the same old mistake, it's very easy to catch yourself and say, there I go again, and to bring yourself back to the road that you've traveled. And it's much quicker, and the release from the old habit is much swifter and effective. Dharma breakthroughs and psychological breakthroughs and whatever breakthroughs we're talking about are the result of an initial understanding and then a repetition of that understanding, which is not enough to prevent you from the old mistake altogether in the beginning, but it means when that old mistake starts happening again, you catch it quicker and you slide into the pathway you made for yourself. So logic is those pathways for us, but only if you have some resonance with them, which is why in analytical meditation, there's the point, but then you have to think about your relationship to that point. You have to make it your own. Feed it back to yourself in your own words, using your own memories and experiences until it lands. Like death is certain, we already knew that. But if you'd really sat with your own mortality, saying that point rings a bell in you. And, you shake off the small things that have gotten you distracted that day.
Maybe it's a bit of general question, but I'm very occupied with the word transformation and the fact that it contains the word form, transformation. And I don't understand if when you're talking about the development of the mind from the conception to perception, is it a 1 minute eureka moment, like the different paths from the one of preparation to the path of seeing? Or is it an ongoing ongoing
Yeah.
procedure. I don't know, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, in Buddhism, we don't use transformation as a word as often as I use it with you. I'm trying to be relatable. We say realization, which has a more kind of boundaried, finite, you are different to how you were before. Yeah, you're fundamentally different to how you were before. And, for example, take the path of preparation. There's a dividing line where you're different than you were before, but there's sections within that where you can still fall backward. And then there's a moment of truth where you no longer can fall back as far. You can still fall back a little, but not as far. And as you progress, you can't fall back as far until you can't fall back at all, until you're only progressing. So there is that kind of discussions, of some of the realizations are a definite, you will always be different from now on. And some of them are, you are different, but you might forget a little bit and backslide and then, shore up. And then as time goes by, it's only progress. So those stages are talked about. Yeah. Yeah, does that answer your question? Ish? Want to ask follow-up? If you ask yourself in your own experience, what are the lessons you've learned so well that you will never forget them? As opposed to the lessons you learn, believe, care about, cherish. But if you're really distracted, you'll forget. There are some mistakes that we've made in our life that we might never do again. Yeah, we thoroughly learn the lesson. We will never do that mistake again. And then there's plenty that we know are mistakes, but we just haven't sat with the negative consequence and sat with its alternative long enough for it to fundamentally have changed us yet. So we know that the mind does have a relationship with how much things are repeated, and how clear they are, what gets repeated, so that's already something we have experience of. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much. We'll just take a minute and let the mind settle and dedicate all of the energy we put into these thoughts. So however we frame awakening, may that awakening occur. And however that awakening occurs, may it be of benefit to both myself and others, benefiting others in an unbiased way, expansive, without partiality. Thanks, guys. See you tonight.